This is a joint initiative that's being brought to you by Kate McNamara and I from Georgetown University. I'm Abe Newman, and I'm the director of the Mortara Center here. And it's a part of a multi-year initiative where we're thinking about how the digital economy is creating national security challenges. And this series in particular is looking at a set of themes. Today, we're going to focus on cybersecurity, but we're going to run through a whole host of issues that the digital economy has raised, from cybersecurity to AI to digital repression. And so I hope that those people that join today will be able to come back another day. Before we get into our topic for today, I just want to acknowledge that Georgetown University's success today is in part the product of enslaved labor and the sale of enslaved people. You can learn more about Georgetown University's effort to understand and address its role in this injustice at slavery.georgetown.edu. For today, as part of this DESC series, we've invited two experts on cybersecurity who will be joining us. The first is Jon Lindsay. He's an associate professor at the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Hoover Institute of Technology, and Jacquelyn Schneider, who is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, California. Both of them are leading experts on cybersecurity and the issues that we'll discuss today. I also wanted to just mention briefly that this series is supported by a generous gift by the Board of Regents at Georgetown University and a grant from the Open Society Foundation. Okay, with that, my big wind up, I want to turn it over to each of our speakers. They're going to give a quick 10-minute opening set of comments on how they see this field, what we can learn about the current state of play in understanding the issues that the digital economy raises for cybersecurity. Then I'll ask a series of questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. When we have the discussion, we're going to have it moderated through the chat function. So if you have comments or questions for our speakers, please put them in the chat, and then we'll engage them with those as the conversation moves forward. Okay, so maybe can I turn it first to Jon? I'm just going alphabetically. I hope that's okay. We didn't plan this before. I don't know if Jon or Jackie, if you have a preference, but I was going to just turn it over to Jon.
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks, Abe, very much for those kind comments, and thanks also to Kate McNamara, the Mortara Center, and the Global Political Economy Project. I think this is an exciting project. It's trying to encourage a rethink of international political economy. And I think that cybersecurity is a great place to start. It's really emblematic of the need to think beyond international relations paradigms. Classic liberalism is all about collective institutions, and cyberspace is an example of collaboration and cooperation on a global scale. Classical realism, it's about the ruthless pursuit of power and the use of strategy to get your way at others' expenses sometimes, right? Cyber conflict is certainly a way to do that. Constructivism is all about intersubjective knowledge, and yet when you look at cyber operations, they're all about deception, taking advantage of knowledge. So this is really sort of emblematic of this new pragmatic turn in international relations to use the best tools to make sense of practice as it appears in the real world. Now, I think the first point I'd like to make is that cybersecurity is no longer new. Today, we're talking about artificial intelligence and disinformation and maybe quantum computing. If we would have had this presentation 10 years ago, that was before Uber and TikTok, we would have been talking about Stuxnet and cyber war and large-scale destruction. If we would have had this conversation 20 years ago, that was before the iPhone, we would have been talking about 9/11 and terrorism and the vulnerability of civilian infrastructure. 30 years ago, before the World Wide Web, we would have been talking about the revolution in military affairs and the ability of militaries to use cyber technologies. Going back even 40 years, before Microsoft Windows and Office, we'd be talking about the movie War Games and worried about teenage hackers with their hoodies. Sadly, I'm old enough to remember all of these conversations. But I think the point is that in a few short decades, cyber conflict has become a really normal feature of global politics. It's simultaneously innovative and really commonplace. It's threatening and yet states tolerate it. It's provocative and yet actors show restraint. It's somewhere between peace and war. Now, the second point I might make is that I don't think cybersecurity was ever new. In many ways, you can see this as a modern version of, classic struggles between spies and counter spies, eavesdroppers and code breakers, cops and robbers, liars, and interrogators, right? This kind of stuff has been going on for a long time. If you look at Sun Tzu and the Art of War 2.5 millennia ago, you see discussions of deception and using spies in order to get advantages without direct military conflict. There are similar writings in the Indian Arthashastra, right? Looking at the importance of counterintelligence and domestic surveillance and information control for solidifying the power of the ruler, both at home and abroad. So when we look at classic intelligence practice, and I would distinguish between 3 different activities. Number 1, espionage, or the collection of information. Number 2, influence or sabotage, which is going out and doing things secretly or on the sly to change behaviors or capabilities. And lastly, counterintelligence efforts to protect against both of these. When you look at these 3 activities, cyber provides new tools for doing these classic activities. Now, at the same time, while intelligence practice is not new, there are some things that are profoundly new and concerning about cybersecurity. Number 1, it's obviously highly digitized, right? Information technology is part of what gives rise to this problem. Now, information systems depend on the trust of the people that build them and use them and buy them. That trust allows people to coordinate their commercial and entertainment activities at unprecedented scale. But when you have more trust in digital systems, you also invite the abuse of trust. Secondly, cybersecurity is intelligence supersized, okay? You're able to do things at scale that were just out of the range of spies back in Sun Tzu's day. Okay, when you look at the example of the SolarWinds hack that came to light in December 2020, right? This was one penetration by a Russian intelligence agency that ended up exposing tens of thousands of organizations, probably actually exploiting more like several hundred of them, including major intelligence agencies. So this was one penetration of a supply chain that provided all of this access at scale. Now, it was an espionage operation, we believe, to collect information, but perhaps that same methodology could be used to profoundly disrupt or influence those organizations. So the scale of potential sub-ROSA interactions is fairly unprecedented. And then the third novel component that I would highlight is the civilianization of intelligence contests. Usually when we think of spy games, we think of organizations like Bletchley Park and the CIA and KGB. These are state intelligence agencies. What they do is usually in the shadow, it's deeply classified. Now, civil society actors are actors, media, and targets of intelligence operations. The commercial cybersecurity industry is often the first to detect and understand some of this activity. They've got unique collection that isn't even available to some states. Moreover, the targets are not just state, military, and diplomatic organizations, or even the leading firms of those states, but civil society actors, journalists, dissidents, academics are often receiving some of the most attention of cyber threat actors. So I think these 3 things, the digitization, supersizing, and civilianization of intelligence contests is something new. So to sum up, I think that while cybersecurity has been around for a while, we're still sort of struggling in international relations to make sense of it. But I think we have many of the right ingredients, but we might need to remix them in a new way. First off, cyber conflict shows up in this gray zone between peace and war. And it also shows up between the great IR traditions of liberalism and realism. Now, this isn't the first time that IR has had to grapple with things that fall into this nether region. In many ways, modern security studies is founded on the need to think across paradigms. The advent of nuclear weapons made it imperative to think about deterrence. And deterrence is interesting, as Thomas Schelling tells us, because it depends on the cooperation of the adversary, right? Both sides have an interest in avoiding large-scale nuclear war. So deterrence is paradoxical in many ways because it uses the means of war for the ends of peace. It uses threats of military action to create stability. Now, in many ways, deception and cybersecurity are the converse of deterrence. Deception is not new, but cybersecurity is making it relevant in the same way that deterrence wasn't new when nuclear weapons made it more relevant. But cybersecurity exploits the means of peace for the ends of war. It uses the same systems and institutions that enable cooperation, but it exploits them to gain a strategic advantage. So when I think about cyber power as something different from military power, this is really organized deception through information systems to gain a strategic advantage. This is inherently confusing and destabilizing, in part because the capability to deceive is democratizing in profound ways. So in short, I would say the information age is also the age of deception, or at least that's the argument I'm trying to make in a book I'm writing. So I'll turn it back over to you, Abe.
Great, thanks, John. That was wonderful. Jackie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And it is a real honor to be here and to be speaking with you guys today. You know, maybe 7, 8 years ago, God, can it be that long? John and I were invited to give a talk. So this is the last time that we were together talking about kind of why cyber matters. And as I was preparing these comments, I thought, my goodness, how much we've learned and how much our views of why cyber matters have evolved. I really came to this problem from a bombs and bullets background, and started wondering, you know, putting cyber within that frame. And my ideas about when and why cyber matter have really evolved. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I think you're going to hear a lot of the same things that you heard in John's talk, which is interesting that kind of our ideas have converged and have probably been influenced by each other over the time period. But, you know, when you start looking at academic scholarship and trying to understand kind of how and why cyber operations would matter, this big thing that we call international relations, you start looking at pieces that were published primarily in kind of international security journals, starting in the early 2010s, leading up between 2010 and 2013. And they're asking questions about like, hey, why does cyber matter? And some people are saying cyber is going to cause war and we're all going to go to war with each other. And others, you know, Eric Gartsky saying, hey, no, this cyber thing is actually like not as important as these core issues about nuclear weapons. But at the same time that this scholarship is having this debate, which is really like this kind of very high level, we're not really getting into granularities or empirics or specifics. Practitioners are trying to make sense of when and why cyber might matter too. And at the same time, you start seeing this kind of these analogies emerging in the public discussion about cyber operations. So cyber Pearl Harbors and cyber Armageddons and cyber 9/11s. And they're working really hard to try and analogize cyber with something that they view as important. Because I think if I could characterize that time period, the general consensus was like, this cyber thing matters, but we don't really know how and why. And so there was a real attempt to try and take cyber and fit it in within analogies that we previously understood. But, you know, it's been almost 10 years since these first discussions. And for John and I, it's been, I don't know, 6, 7 years since we had our first discussion about kind of when and why cyber mattered. So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about what we have learned in cyber. And I want to say that in general, if you can take nothing else from this, what we have seen and what we have learned is that lots of fizzle, lots of cyber fizzle, not a lot of bang. And that matters. So first off, this idea that cyber is lots of fizzle, not a lot of bang. Where does that come from? Well, in the last few years, there has been increasing attempts to try and create empirics and look at the data. So, hey, we get all these great analogies that were very evocative of cyber Pearl Harbors and cyber Armageddons. Is this actually happening? So work done by like Brandon Valeriano and his co-authors, as well as work done through CFR, trying to compile databases. Okay, what is the universe of cyber incidents that are occurring, and how many of these can be related or correlated to more violence? And the big story there is not a lot of story. There are a lot of cyber operations that are occurring, but there's not a correlation between these cyber operations and more likely chances that states go to war with each other or that wars become more violent. You look at work that's done by Nadia Kostyuk, for example. Nadia is looking at how cyber operations are shaping the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, or in their conflicts in Crimea. And she says, I don't find a strong correlation between an increase in cyber operations and an increase in conventional conflict or violence. Well, this is kind of a hard thing for those of us who started staring at cyber from a security perspective, because it's a little bit confusing. Hey, we think cyber matters, but it doesn't seem to matter for war, which is kind of maybe the primary dependent variable we started looking at. But at the same time that it doesn't matter for war, there's a lot more happening in cyberspace in general, especially since the end of the pandemic. I mean, we've seen almost 600% increases in ransomware as all of us have moved to virtual interfaces. The theft of intellectual property, both by commercial and criminal actors, but also increasingly by state actors, is becoming much more of a huge element in when and why cyber matters to international relations. And then this idea of massive network exploitation and the ways in which our centralization of data and the use of artificial intelligence has really enabled these very large scale data exploitation by states like China and Russia, and how that kind of exchange and stealing of information is really changing not only kind of states' ability to harness economic power, but also their ability to try and influence and use information to shape power in kind of these non-military power ways, which I think is a lot of what Jon's talking about. So it turns out that based on like the characteristics of cyberspace, it was really, really hard to create the kind of Armageddon or Pearl Harbor that we had anticipated back in like 2010 and 2013. But it is actually very easy for a proliferation of actors to create economic costs. And these economic costs have the ability to aggregate and create friction and uncertainty in ways that do not look like typical conflict, but do look very much like distributions of power based on the redistribution of knowledge. Okay, so why? One of the biggest questions has been, okay, we don't see a lot of cyber bang, but people are really, I mean, cyber attacks and cyber operations seem almost more ubiquitous than they were before. How is this possible? How do we have both more cyber and yet it is not making these huge kind of large physical effects? Okay, well, there's a few things here. One is just that the way the humans interact with this particular kind of technology. And this is something I've worked on in war games and then in survey experiments with my co-author, Sarah Krebs, where we're looking at like, how do individuals respond to cyber attacks? And is this kind of qualitatively different than how they respond to attacks in other domains? And the answer is yes. Individuals tend to underestimate the threat of cyber vulnerabilities or the effect of cyber vulnerabilities. And so that even if we hold effects constant across, cyber attacks versus bombs versus, even nuclear weapons, you find that individuals are less likely to be willing to retaliate in cyber. Instead, they really view cyber operations as this bin of capabilities that look a lot more like economic sanctions or diplomacy or intelligence. And because of that, that has created a kind of tacit threshold at the bottom edge of escalation, in which cyber operations are binned with other, as Jon kind of alluded to, what we consider gray operations, ways in which states are trying to contest with each other and vie for power and influence without escalating to violent conflict. Now, this kind of status quo threshold is really good for violence and instability on this kind of high level. but it creates instability in these lower levels because there's a perception that states are able to combat and contest with each other and proliferate cyber capabilities and cyber network exploitation attempts without having any real consequences. And you see this is kind of where the Biden administration is really struggling right now, because they recognize, hey, we don't think cyber operations are going to create nuclear war, but ooh, they're really mattering. They're taking a huge cost for our economy. And as we're becoming more and more dependent on digital technologies, they also increasingly make us more vulnerable to how that influences kind of our health and domestic security. But they can't figure out how do we then keep actors from taking these actions when they are below kind of the status quo threshold that has emerged. Okay, so does that mean that cyber is not strategic or that it doesn't matter because cyber doesn't create war? And the answer is no. I want to go back to kind of something that Jon was talking about, because the reason why cyber matters today and why it always mattered was because it erodes trust. And trust is an extremely important part of the digital world. It's important for governance because we believe in the information and the way in which we vote and the way in which we rely on digital technologies in order to uphold democratic institutions. It's important for the economy and financial markets because increasingly the world is nothing but zeros and ones. And the ways in which that we conduct commerce and that we believe that something has value is really based on whether we believe in the digital structures that underlie our modern financial system. And even for military power, this belief in the information that I'm receiving through situational awareness and through my sensors, this is really, really important to be able to conduct the kind of high certainty and long range strike decision advantage operations that states like the United States have been building. So these cyber operations, they don't create physical effects. They're like a termite infestation where they slowly are eroding our trust in these digital capabilities, which really have become the foundation of modern society. And so how states think about dealing with those issues, that's going to be the true impact that cyber operations have on international relations. It's not going to be whether this kind of spirals into nuclear conflict. I find that very hard to believe that that will occur. But I do think that this trust concept really matters. And it matters for practitioners because in their focus in creating analogies about bombs and Armageddons, they're also building systems that look more like how we combat a military attack. But they're not focusing on the real kind of countermeasures that you need to take in order to de-incentivize these types of cyber attacks. And really, it comes into an investment in resilience. Investments both in technological resilience, whether that's kind of investing in different network structures that are less likely to be susceptible to large-scale cyber attacks, but more importantly, investing in human resilience, the ability for humans to interrogate information. I think for many, many years, we've built digital architectures that double down on certainty, trying to create certainty. And the reason cyber operations matter is that they create uncertainty. And when the system is built for certainty, the deliberate introduction of uncertainty can be existential for the system. So how do we think about creating resiliency measures that allow us to not have this kind of binary, I believe it or I don't believe it, but a graceful degradation of trust? And I think that's something, we're starting this conversation with cybersecurity, but over the next few weeks, the next few months, you're going to talk about artificial intelligence, and all of these things are related to each other because they create the digital infrastructure that makes cyber matter or not matter. So I hope that kind of as we move on, you think about how all these things link together. And I'm excited to have this conversation. Thanks so much for letting me opine for 10 minutes or so.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie, so much. Both Jon and Jackie, those were perfect remarks to set up the conversation. I wanted to first ask people who are in the audience, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to those as we move forward. I wanted to just start the conversation by picking up on the kind of several themes that were both in Jon and Jackie's remarks, which is kind of putting the public at the center of cybersecurity conversations, which is, I don't really think, where the conversation has often been. So a lot of the literature is very focused on taking out key infrastructures, or, can we decimate somebody's nuclear program, or, can we get blackmail information about leaders, those kinds of conversations. But when I think about the kind of ransomware attacks, like Howard University, which I sit basically 6 blocks from where I'm doing this from my home. Don't tell my employer, but I'm at Zoom in my home, and Howard University just got shut down by a ransomware attack. And it's one of those things where it's like, what's the point of that? It resonates much more with this conversation about trust and distrust than it does about that's going to lead to an attack on the homeland, that kind of a conversation. But I think thinking through how, when the public is the target of these initiatives, and that it's from what Jon was saying, a deception strategy of a long game. It's not about, do I win this battle or this, this engagement, but there's a longer set of kind of objectives. And I don't really know what the objectives are. Even I really love Jon's description of this is, using the means of peace for war. But when I think about the deception that's happening, what is the hope? And is it just to erode the population's general trust or specific trust in these institutions? Anyway, I'd just love to hear both of you guys kind of talk a little bit about, if we shift to the people as the target and we think about the long game, what does that maybe reveal?
I'll go ahead and jump on it first, and I'll jump on this idea of actors and the different stakes that actors have in this domain. So ransomware against Howard University, or ransomware against a school district, right? Why is that happening? These are criminals, right? These are opportunistic criminals. So there is a lot of activity that's happening in cyberspace that is completely separate of kind of state-based goals, right? These are individuals that have converted their way of making revenue from holding up a bank, which is inherently dangerous, to ransomware, which if you've ever seen kind of a conversation between ransomware operators and those that they're targeting, it's like very civil. I mean, to be honest, you get better customer service from ransomware folks than I do like my insurance, and absolutely like better than my internet provider, So that is a whole set of issues. And some of that is domestic, but a lot of it are actors that are outside the United States. These are kind of like international criminal gangs. And this is where there is a bit of a relationship, and like this murky relationship with state sponsors. So this is a complication between the US and Russia right now, because a lot of these actors are actually operating physically out of Eastern Europe and Russia. And they are not necessarily they're not mercenaries for the Russian government. I wouldn't say Putin meets with these people and is like, hey, target a lot of these companies. That's really helpful for us. It's more just like, I'm going to look away and I'm not going to punish them. And so the Biden administration is thinking about like, well, how do I convince states to be responsible stewards in this domain? And I think actually part of the way you convince them is when international criminal actors end up having an effect on those states as well. And China has experienced a little of this. Now, where it gets murkier is where states like China are actually now using some of these mercenaries as proxies that allow them to gain accesses and to develop vulnerability, to develop exploits that then the China can say, is this, mercenaries. And the idea is that it decreases incentives for states like the US to take measures that would be directly pointed at the state. Instead to have to deal with this on a criminal level. So there's a lot of kind of competing interests here. And then there are like actual like state-based interests, which is the actual kind of erosion of trust. And this I would say is more of a Russian strategy than a Chinese strategy. the Russians have a explicit emphasis on degrading trust in democratic institutions, not so much at degrading trust in financial institutions. That is not their incentive. But there is that is a strategic effort by the Russians. And then, finally, if you look at places like North Korea actually does not only sanction, but develop these type of actors, mostly so they can gain revenue for the regime. So we have like a whole lot of different types of motivations here. And I've talked a lot to Jon. Maybe if you want to cover or discuss like the public-private intersection and how that complicates this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Abe, I think that confusion that you were expressing is in many ways part of the point, right? I mean, it's these interesting seams between organizations, between institutions, and between intellectual concepts that end up getting weaponized in this space. And it's precisely because they're not well understood and not well institutionalized in terms of a security strategy and organizations that know what to do, that we constantly find ourselves back on our heels, right? So, the one thing that so many of these attacks have in common is that while we're not surprised that they happen, that we're always a little bit surprised that they exploited that vector, that you hit that target, or that you did this. I didn't see that coming, right? So like there's this kind of constant refresh of surprise that is happening. I think I just wanted to kind of tease out that civilian actors get involved in three really different ways. Number one, and I think both of you alluded to this, is that civilian actors, or I should say non-state, non-government actors, become threat actors, and that's criminals, right? And criminals that are directly doing this, the whole interesting ecosystem of support to the industry and stuff that's very gray. I mean, I agree with Jackie. I mean, the ransomware support is very, very interesting. And some of it's extremely gray. Some of these are third parties that come in to offer to help you negotiate down the ransom, and they may actually do that, but they're also facilitating the payment of a ransom and may even be in cahoots with the attackers. So like, that's always been a problem with hostage negotiations. But so you've got threat actors themselves that are part of the problem. Then you've got civilian actors that are providing the media for attacks. So vendors that create software with vulnerabilities and service providers that put up the infrastructure that allows command and control, right? I mean, this is exploitation by, with, and through civilian technologies, commercial technologies, even if it's a pure state-on-state interaction. And then lastly, and you also alluded to this with Howard and other places, I mean, the targets are increasingly civilian, and that's commercial industries, that's the easiest to understand, but then this entire range of other people being exploited for economic and political means. Again, there's a classic intelligence theme there. When we think about intelligence from a Western perspective, we think about technical collection against the Soviets and fairly honorable above board things. But a whole lot of intelligence services around the world and throughout history have been really preoccupied with internal security and regime security, right? So civilians find themselves on the receiving end of high-end military grade, spyware capabilities. And, Israel's NSO group is sort of, and their Pegasus software is the poster child here. So yeah, I mean, I think this, again, it puts us in this IPE world that a lot of us international security people are not used to dealing in, because we understand states and war and strategy and deterrence and coercion, but we're not used to thinking about like all of these crazy, ambiguous transnational interactions across levels of analysis where civilian actors are really important. Doesn't mean they're the most important. They're often in being encouraged or enabled by state actors. But I think that's a bigger part of your world than our world. But these worlds need to come together to understand cybersecurity.
Great. So just to keep pressing on this point, Philip Rogers in the chat, he has this question of, kind of what can we learn from, or is there a similarity between privateering in the 17 and the 1800s? Because what I think is so, and Jackie brought this up too, which is there's a vagary about the connections between these groups and states. So, dark side, is it just a criminal group that just happens to be in Russia, that's money. Like we know that the oligarchic networks of these societies, they're all deeply connected with the governments. So it's not just it's very difficult for me to believe that it's a one-way street. But at the same time, we've had periods of history where global economic, let's say, criminal networks are interacting with states as states interact with each other. And so I don't want you to be an expert on privateering in the 17 and 1800s, but I do think it's a worthwhile exercise to think about other periods where there was more permeability between states and economic factors. You could also think about like the period of transnational imperial private networks. I'm thinking Jason Sharman has done all this work on the East India Company. And in those moments too, there's always security concerns that are integrated with the economic concerns. And the way the money goes back to the core, whatever the core and the periphery relationship. So I want to just throw that on the table. We also have a comment from Sean Connor, who's really, I think, pressing to think a little bit more about the resilience question, about how, he says, do we need a different fundamental paradigm of the structure of information on networks? And, I believe very much of like, we need to think about resilience or redundancies, these different ways to think about how supply chains, for example, could, live through when states start to use them as choke points in their engagement with each other. But when it comes to practicality, I think it's often quite difficult, because the management literature, at least in that space on supply chains, it's really thinking about random breakdowns in supply chains. It's not thinking about intentional breakdowns in supply chains. So when you start to think about like how these networks should be reconstructed in the face of intentional uncertainty or deception, where it's not just about gleaning information or trying to fake your adversary, but it's really to try to disrupt the economic processes of your whatever adversary or criminal target. So those are two very different questions, but I appreciate your thoughts on either. Or you can also disregard one, or it's an open conversation.
Let me just jump in on the privateering one, because I just blurbed a wonderful book that's forthcoming from Florian Egloff, the scholar at ETH with Oxford, and I think it's called Semi-State Actors in Cybersecurity. But he really, really takes this analogy very, very seriously. And he spent a lot of time in the British archives trying to understand, Elizabeth's strategy for, working with privateers and, the gray line between piracy and privateering. And then he really looks at how that resembles in many ways, the commercial cybersecurity industry, which collects a lot of information that the U.S. government doesn't see until it comes through. They're often the first to detect and attribute, a lot of these. I mean, think of SolarWinds is interesting, right? FireEye got hacked, and they started, they got pissed about this, and they started pulling the string, and that led to SolarWinds, and then they called Microsoft and the FBI, and then they announced it just a few days later, and we all kind of dealt with the blowback from that. Compare that to Kim Philby, who was outed in kind of the late 50s, and that wasn't publicly announced for another 10 years because it was a totally internal government affair. So private actors, cybersecurity actors, have become really, really important, and I think there is a lot that can be learned from that analogy. And the principal agency issues are huge, right? I mean, especially if you think about cyber defense as a form of counterintelligence, and then you think about counterintelligence in terms of identifying and doubling enemy agents, and suddenly you realize that defense is a pretty active game where you are monitoring and maybe even interfering in the adversary's activities. And if we have private firms that are doing that, then that might mean that for the sake of cybersecurity, they are actively defending forward or hacking back. And there's lots of ways to discuss this. That's a big conceptual and policy challenge, right? To think about like how the state should encourage, regulate, manage that activity.
Yeah, I think I would say that private sector plays an outsized role in the development of what are appropriate behaviors and the technology. So, if you look at kind of cybersecurity technology and where it's developed, it's not going to be out of the government, right? This isn't the government investing in like big missiles. So first off, the technology is generally coming from the private sector, but also the private sector is generally setting the norms about like how it is responded to. I mean, the government would like to say that this is regulation, but generally not. So if you look at how the financial sector is dealing with cybersecurity issues, and then how big cyber intelligence firms are affecting or taking away agency from the state. So, these big cybersecurity firms are generally naming and shaming, sometimes quite often before governments. And so it's taking a lot of the power out of government's hands about figuring out how am I going to shape this narrative? How am I going to think about identifying attribution? And it is now in a private sector hand. So I think in this realm, the private sector actor is generally much more important than the government actor. And I've actually run war games with the critical leaders in critical infrastructure and the government. And part of the game, the purpose of the games is to teach the government, you guys are not a big player here and you have very limited role that you can actually engage. So how do you think about engaging across these sectors? And the Obama administration and then also moving into the Trump and the Biden administrations have worked really hard at developing these public-private relationships to share information and try and make at least in our government, try and make it a little bit less unwieldy. I want to talk about networks for a second, because I think you're on to something that's really, really important about how the structure of the network matters for resiliency. And if you look at kind of there is literature within kind of the network sciences about what characteristics are most likely to lead to more resilient networks. But there's generally a trade-off between resilient networks and extremely efficient or quick networks. And I see a lot of tension, for example, between the centralization of data and using kind of large database hubs in order to parse information very quickly, and this idea of resiliency. And so I've been actually looking into this and then how perceptions of these network structures affect individuals' beliefs about how vulnerable the network is and how that means that they respond to threats in the network. So we're just starting that project, but we're interested in kind of how these network structures, not only like, okay, which network structures are more resilient, but then also humans are inherently, I'll make this, humans are inherently irrational. How do we respond to these perceptions of vulnerability and threat? And what are the incentives to build structures that are more resilient versus structures that are kind of more efficient and better for speed? So
That's that sounds like such a cool project, Jackie. I'm really excited to learn more about that. Okay, we have two more questions on the queue that are very different. So the first one is from Caitlin Talmadge, and I'm going to read it because this is for like you guys who are like nukes and cyber. I could not replicate this in my own words. So my question, she says, is about the relationship between cyber and nuclear. If you were working on this round of the nuclear posture review, I feel like this is like a you're writing your essay, your entrance to college for cyber college. What, if anything, would you want the government to focus on regarding the nexus between nuclear and cyber? I'm wondering, in particular, if you have any comments on where this fits in with the emerging notions of integrated deterrence. It seems even though cyber may have fizzled in some domains, cyber attacks really could have very devastating effects in the nuclear realm, given the role of C2. Thank you.
Well, I don't know, John. So John did like the formative work here, like with his.
Hold on. Caitlin has put something else. She says she's asking about this not just because she works on nuclear, but I can tell you it's because she works on nuclear. I know Caitlin quite well, and I know that is why she's interested in this.
Well, I am appreciative of Caitlin's question because I have spent the last 3 years looking at this question. So I've been running, building off great work that John did with his co-author, Eric Gartsky. I highly recommend, they wrote a great article, Thermonuclear Cyber War. we were testing these hypotheses. So over the last 3 years, we ran a war game with 580 participants all over the world, looking at how if we introduced a vulnerability to nuclear command and control, this is kind of like the worst case possible vulnerability in the nuclear world, how does that influence both incentives for deliberate escalation, i.e. Do the players feel like they need to launch nuclear weapons earlier in the crisis because of this vulnerability? Do they use the exploit if we give it to them? How does this vulnerability and exploit affect the overall dynamics of the crisis? So I have a good news story and like a not good news story here. The good news story, and I think this actually fits very nicely with kind of the work that Jon has done in the past, is that individuals tend to underestimate their vulnerability. So whereas like Ashton Carter was super worried about how fears about vulnerabilities in the NC3 would lead to these deliberate decisions and these like fear that would lead to nuclear war, we don't find that. This is like the like cognitive puzzle. It's like people just do not fear cyber threats, even when we kind of hit them on the head with the cyber vulnerability. But what's interesting and a little bit more worrisome is the relationship between these exploits and overconfidence, also something Jon talks about, and how this leads to more incentives for counterforce. So what we found is that it was the exploit, the cyber exploit we gave people, not the vulnerability, that really mattered to the dynamics in the crisis game. So the exploit, first off, we didn't think people would use it, or not use it that often. Oh my gosh, they used it in the vast majority of the games, including for the games where we told them they didn't have an exploit. They actually wrote it into their crisis response plan. So there's a huge incentive to use these cyber exploits against nuclear command and control. But having that exploit actually had a correlation with teams that were more likely to take nuclear counterforce measures. So what does that mean? That were teams with the cyber exploit were more likely to use airstrikes or naval strikes or special operations missions to try and take out the adversary's nuclear capabilities. So there seems to be kind of this like very odd and somewhat unintuitive relationship between the cyber capability and engendering overconfidence in other domains. The other thing that I think was really interesting is that some of the response to the cyber vulnerability was to move to automation or artificial intelligence when it came to the use of nuclear weapons. So this like incentive to delegate to lower levels, which I think, this relationship with AI is something that this is a theme that needs to continue. These are two sides of the same coin. So it's optimistic. I don't see incentives for deliberate escalation, but I'm more pessimistic when it comes to cyber's relationship to inadvertent escalation or accidents.
Thanks. I think I'd make maybe 2 points to Caitlin's great question. One is a military technical point, and the other is a political point. On the military technical side, I think we need to be really careful about inferring from observed cyber fizzles to cyber capabilities, right? So, I mean, we kind of overfit on cases like Stuxnet, which was this very exquisite, subtle manipulation of Iranian systems, and then assume that cyber can't do very much. Well, there were political reasons why Stuxnet didn't do very much. There was a lot of restraint. We now know a lot more about other capabilities. There was this war plan called Nitro Zeus, et cetera, that shows that like there is the potential for cyber to go big. There just hasn't been the motivation for it to be there. So technically that capacity is there and is getting worse. Question is always explaining, well, why do the actors with the capability not have the motivation? Now, if we're talking about a nuclear crisis, those actors are going to have that motivation. So all of the kind of caveats we say about, no boom in cyber may actually be accepted away in exactly these situations. So the political point I think I'd like to make is that when we look at cyber and nuclear capabilities, they have almost exactly opposite informational qualities, right? The whole point of having a nuclear weapon is to make the other side terrified about starting or escalating a war. And it works because it's hard to defend against nukes. Nukes are obviously and horrifically destructive. You can parade them through the square, right? And they don't go away. You can't do any of that with cyber weapons because they depend on deception and accesses and exploits that are very, very secret, okay? And you can't reveal these sources and methods. So you have one that is predicated on revelation and the other that is predicated on staying hidden. And so what happens when you bring these together? And my concern is that you could find yourself in this brinksmanship crisis where you have an exploit of the other side's nuclear C2 that you cannot reveal, which means you know that the balance of power is in your favor, and so you're willing to stand fast in that contest. The other side believes that it cares more about the stakes, and therefore you're going to back down because it doesn't know that its systems have been owned. So now you get into this situation where, you know, non-rational factors can take over and there's more risk that gets built into the system. And I'm really disturbed by Jackie's wargaming findings because it seems to support this, right? It's not the side that thinks it's vulnerable, it's the side that knows that it's got the cyber weapon that it's going to use in this counterforce mode, right? Which could give you a better chance of winning that war, but also make it more likely that you have that war in the first place. So, you know, I think I want to make sure, and I'm really of two minds of what to do about this, right? I mean, on the one hand, like, if you're going to be in a nuclear shooting war, of course you want cyber. Like, who wouldn't want to take down command and control? Like, that's going to limit damage. Like, I would want to have that stuff. And yet it comes with this liability. So, you know, at the very least, we need to make sure that, you know, strategists and especially civilian decision makers, like, are really aware of what these trade-offs really look like when they're building in these options.
What I think is interesting, to bring it back to the conversation about IP and private actors, is a lot of the solutions that I would recommend for a private actor about thinking about resiliency, creating networks for resiliency, are the exact same solutions I would proffer to anybody starting an NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review. I would say, look, you need to look as much into the resiliency of the networks that you're creating as it is the efficiency and the ability to effectively centralize and gain information. And so, unfortunately, I think the Department of Defense is usually far behind, like the financial system, when thinking about cybersecurity. But they probably need to think as much about that cybersecurity as they do other, you know, nuclear defense options.
See, Abe, when you said we were going to have an NPR-like conversation, I bet you didn't expect this.
I didn't. I was talking about like Kojo Namdi, who's like the local DC NPR guy. I wasn't thinking about the Nuclear Posture Review. Okay, so we're coming close to the end of our time. So we have 7 minutes. We have a few last questions. I want to try to get to what we can. So Divjat Bawa, he has, I think it's a great question. It's stemming off of a recent New York Times op-ed by Dmitry Aplerovich, who was the former CTO of CrowdStrike. And in that op-ed, he argued for an offensive strategy in addition to diplomacy when dealing with ransomware and these cyber attacks. And it comes on the heels of Chris Krebs, who was the former head of cybersecurity at the Homeland Security Department, saying we need to release the hounds, quote, end quote, on these people. But it's really this question of, is there a better way to combat the threat of these ransomware attacks by going on the offense, where the state, the US government, is really trying to crush those sets of actors? I want to add a second part to this question, which is, I also think that from Jackie's war games and also from what Jon's work has shown, that I'd like to hear what you think about the impact that these successful ransomware attacks have on the government's uncertainty about other potential state actions that could be not just driven by economic concerns, by other concerns. And so I'll just bring up the Colonial Pipeline incident, which, at least in me, is like, that's a big vulnerability. Like, that demonstrated quite a vulnerability at a societal level from ransomware attacks. So what are the cognitive or the strategic implications of these successful ransomware? And does the US government have some incentive to really need to shut them down in order to maintain the public trust that a state won't do the same thing in the next iteration? I turned it over to you. You can answer any or all of those.
I was deferring to Jon, but based on the
I was deferring on you. This is a solarium question
Okay.
all over it.
All right, good. So okay. Why is Chris Krebs saying release the hounds? This is kind of a strange analogy. In general, just a little context, the US has been extremely restrained in its use of offensive cyber, both against criminal actors and state actors. That's something from the Obama administration, and then it actually trickled. The Trump administration gave more authorities to the US government to do this, primarily in the military perspective. Interesting that Chris Krebs is saying release the hounds because CISA does not have these authorities. Only the Department of Defense does. But there's been a lot of debate about if US releases the hounds, how is that going to increase escalation dynamics? Okay, so I actually think that being more assertive in using US offensive cyber to take out the infrastructure and the capabilities that both criminals and state actors are using to propagate cyber attacks, I think that's a good thing. I think we can do more of it without worrying about escalation. I think it will somewhat increase the cost of ransomware attacks, which will, this is criminals are extremely rational, right? The more it costs them, the less likely they are to do it. Good. It's not enough. We have found that offensive cyber has short duration effects in general, and they are extremely adaptive. And so their ability to adapt is going to be like whack-a-mole. Maybe useful whack-a-mole, but it's whack-a-mole. I think that the Biden administration's choice to go after cryptocurrencies, which is the primary way that ransomware gets paid, is actually extremely interesting and might be very systemic and have large-scale effects, because if you can't pay somebody, then what's the point of ransomware? And it is very, very difficult to do this with regular currency. The cryptocurrency has enabled ransomware to hide, essentially. So this is really ingenious, and also I think goes to a larger question of kind of how these digital currencies are affecting state power, which I'm sure you guys will end up talking about. So I think that Dimitri is right. We can use more capabilities, but it's never going to be enough. And so more strategies like what the Biden administration was thinking about with taking out cryptocurrencies, I think will be more effective. And then in general about whether these ransomware is a bigger problem for critical infrastructure. I think yes and no. In general, Colonial Pipeline showed a big vulnerability, but they didn't actually. Everyone still got gas, right? And so there are incentives to thinking about how does the government subsidize or punish infrastructure to not only investing in cybersecurity, but thinking about manual and redundancies, and are there subsidies that we can provide companies so that they build in more resiliency?
One quick comment. I know we're short on time. And I think this really highlights, kind of going back to this original theme, the difference between thinking about cyber and intelligence or military frameworks. You want your intelligence organizations to be very, very active in peacetime, right? You want them finding out what the other side's doing. You want them disrupting the other side's intelligence services. And, there, I think, is a strong argument to be made and evidence behind it that suggests that a very active intelligence contest during the Cold War is part of what kept it cold, because it provided mutual information about capabilities and interests on all sides. So you want your intel services doing that. You don't want your military, being active unless they really, really have to, right? If your militaries are active, then that's a bad day, or a bad day is coming. And now we're in this gray zone where we have a military organization, Cybercom, that is borrowing all of this capacity from the intelligence community to do a lot of stuff that looks a lot like intel at large scale. So yeah, we want them forward and active, but do you want the military to be doing that? Is that right? Does that send other kinds of signals? So these are hard questions, because again, it falls in that ambiguous gray zone that activates these opposite things. In general, I do think that this is probably okay and even a good idea, because a lot of these actors are opting into this area because they don't want to escalate. So all the empirical evidence we have is that the cyber domain will support this kind of low-level instability. So I'm not worried about the escalatory consequences, but it's hard.
So this was a great conversation. One of the things that it made me think about was, Jon had this point about how the private actors, the economy, is often the medium of these threats and these vulnerabilities. And then Jackie had this point, that the basic structure of these private actors in the economy are often or increasingly changing into a more centralized structure. So if you think about the global economic networks for finance or information or production, there are these central players that are increasingly taking over, dominating market competition. And so when you put those two things together, it's like, will there be a next iteration of cyber where it's thinking about that in combination with each other, of how changes in the economy are really creating new threat dynamics, as opposed to the heyday of the internet when everything was, crazy and decentralized and whatever. Anyway, it's just a closing thought of something that I took away from this conversation. I think could, some PhD student out there could write a whole dissertation just about that. But I want to thank you guys again for joining us for this conversation. I want to thank the Open Society Foundation for their sponsorship and the Board of Regents for their generous gift. And the next conversation will be about social media with Sarah Krebs in just a few weeks. And we're hoping that everybody can rejoin and we'll continue the conversation. Thanks again, everybody.